Hello and welcome to China Dispatches, a European Chamber podcast that shares on-the-ground insights from European business leaders and experts on doing business in China. I'm your host, Carl Hayward. In recent years, the fragility of global supply chains has been exposed. Numerous disruptions, including the COVID-19 pandemic, geopolitical developments and new and forthcoming legislation, for example on sustainability and decarbonisation, have led businesses to rethink their supply chain strategies, with risk management and resilience now being prioritised, even at the expense of efficiency and cost. Looking at the China market specifically, according to the European Chamber's recently published annual position paper 2022-2023, China's standing as an investment destination is being eroded. One of the key factors undermining its attractiveness is that its reliability as a sourcing destination is being challenged. This is an additional reason that is leading European companies operating in China to review their supply chain strategies. In today's episode of China Dispatches, we're going to look at what kind of changes companies are making to their supply chains, what the implications are, and what we can expect in the future. Supply chains is also the topic of the July-August 2022 edition of Eurobiz, the European Chamber's bi-monthly magazine. Links to access this issue of Eurobiz, as well as the position paper, will be added to the show notes. I'd like to welcome our guest speakers, Joerg Wuttke, President of the European Chamber, and Jens Eskelund, Vice President of the European Chamber. Thanks very much for joining. Before looking at some of the more recent developments, I just want to go back to last year's Business Confidence Survey 2021, which had a section on supply chains revealing that 9 times as many Chamber members are onshoring supply chains into China as those that are offshoring. Joerg, what are some of the reasons that might drive companies to onshore?
Onshoring definitely has an operational angle to it. We have companies sourcing more from China because there's more value in the marketplace. For example, my company is building up a huge plant in South China, and we have been sourcing much more than we have done for past projects because the market is able to deliver, in particular on the IT side. So onshoring definitely also means that you stay in the same currency zone, and onshoring also partly because of legislation. China is stressing secure and controllable. Of course, you have to see how much your operation fits to that kind of ambition from the Chinese government. So it's many reasons for that one, but primarily I would say it's business reasons, and it doesn't mean that we're cutting ourselves off from the outside world.
This year's position paper depicts quite a complicated picture for business, with one of the most disruptive factors being China's COVID policy. Jens, in what ways were supply chains impacted by COVID containment measures, and how did the lockdown of several major cities in spring of this year, including most notably Shanghai for 2 months or more, impact this picture? And how about the logistics industry specifically?
I think that COVID has really proven the old saying that no chain is stronger than the weakest link. It has been a very, very varied picture we have seen. We have seen that China's ports have basically continued to function without much interruption. Even Wuhan, at the very height of the COVID epidemic in China, was actually only closed down for a week. And the ports have generally, with a few exceptions, been performing very, very well. Where we have seen the big issues have been in regards to land transport, in particular when goods are moving between provinces, between cities, where local legislation, where local initiatives have made it very, very difficult for companies to move around. And we should keep in mind that a lot of these companies here are dependent on sourcing from multiple suppliers, and that has basically been disabled in many places during the pandemic. So resilience really is at a premium now. We need to work on the predictability, transparency, and flexibility of supply chains. That must be main lessons following what we have just been through and continue to go through, actually.
So, I mean, when we were talking about the BCS saying that there were going to be people onshoring, or there are more companies onshoring, do you think that if we took the survey now, there'd be a change in that? Do you think people would be maybe rethinking that in light of the fact that the COVID lockdowns have had such an impact on logistics?
I think definitely that instead of being so intensely focused on supply chain efficiency, resiliency is becoming a much bigger part of the question. People want to make sure that they'll be able to function either if one supplier in one location is impacted by some of these things going on. So what I think and what we hear from our members is happening now, that people, they are investing in looking at contingency planning and also looking at additional sourcing outside of China to support supply chains.
Okay, so we'll get onto contingencies a bit later, but COVID aside, what are some of the other aspects of China's policy making that might prompt companies to shift their supply chain strategies at the moment?
I think it's important at the outset to say that supply chain and supply chain regulation is actually something China has done very, very well. There is a reason that China has evolved into becoming the world's largest, by far, export nation. And that is this, amazing ability to build really, really cost-efficient supply chains that delivers great value in time and reliable.
Yeah.
All that has sort of, to some extent, been thrown up in the air right now. So I don't think we can really, fault supply chain regulation and the way that supply chains are being implemented. I think it's other things at play here. COVID is a big one right now, obviously, but we also see the geopolitical tension that force people to rethink some of the supply chains, and we see sanctions. So a lot of things that are not actually related to sort of the mechanics of supply chains are actually now significantly impacting supply chains and supply chain decisions, and that's something that we need to follow very intensely.
Yeah, sure. So, sort of staying on that topic of legislation, how about the International Maritime Organization's forthcoming regulations? Essentially, it's aimed at reducing the carbon footprint of shipping. What's the impact there? And is it an equal impact? Are all shippers going to be impacted the same? How are European shippers responding to this?
Oh, this is absolutely something that we welcome. Europe is taking a leadership position when it comes to reduce the carbon intensity of a supply chain. And it's something that we also see in China is being prioritized. In the longer term, the only way really that we can ensure that there will also be customers for intercontinental transport is if the industry is serious about reducing the carbon intensity of transport. Now, shipping is already perhaps the most carbon efficient mode of transporting, but still there's much more that can be done. If you look at shipping in isolation, if shipping was a country, it would be the 6th or 7th largest carbon emitter in the world. So that is a huge task. But the technical solutions exist today, and now it's a matter of moving to execution. And we need China to be a part of that game plan.
Just one final point on that. I remember we had an exchange before we released the position paper. And one of the things that you mentioned was actually European shippers are already investing heavily in the technology that they need to reduce their carbon footprint. But the key point that you wanted to emphasize at that point is it needs China to play a really strong role there as well to facilitate it.
It needs to be global legislation, but on the technical side, today China is manufacturing about 50% tonnage the world's ships. So you cannot go and decarbonize shipping without having China being a very, very integral part of that effort. Yeah,
it's an important point. So staying with global legislation, Joerg, what are some of the more important emerging regulations? I'm thinking about the EU's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive and the US, which has already brought into effect the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. How is this affecting European companies in China? What are the things they need to look out for? And how real are the risks associated with these two pieces of legislation?
Well, it's a real risk. The US is not kidding around with people who have not done their homework and proven that in their supply chain in China, there's definitely not even 0.1% of forced labor. So it all boils down to auditing, to checking, to verifying. And that's, of course, a huge challenge in China. We have the German supply chain law coming up on the 1st of January next year. We have the European Parliament talking about forced labor issues. And so in a way, it's very clear the legislations across the world are gearing up and you have to do your homework. And if you can't do it, you then have to look for other alternatives and move your production outside, such as done by the textile industry. And we have the prominent members of Adidas and Nike and H&M that has done it already. Yeah. There's a logic behind it. You have a global pledge. And if you can't verify it and can't prove it, you have to move on to the detriment of employment in China, obviously. And then, of course, we have the new regulation coming up that might be biting us. It's the carbon border adjustment mechanism. That is certainly for people that are in production with high energy intensity, such as chemicals, for example. Of course, this is going to bite. European attempt is in order to avoid leakage, carbon leakage, as it's called, meaning that we are moving production out of Europe to countries which are more lenient on pollution, and in order to then tax it, because the carbon taxation is so different priced in Europe than in China. It's actually 10% just in China. Hence, it comes to mind that, of course, you can pollute more here. And that's not acceptable. So in a way, we have to do our homework, and that is difficult because is China willing to accept more transparency? Is it willing to accept more accountability in our operations over here? And that is a huge challenge we have. It should be in their interest, definitely, but it's hard to come by with.
Yeah, I mean, on the topic of transparency, and just to go back to companies that have operations in Xinjiang, one of the things that we mentioned in the position paper is that we need China to be able to create the conditions whereby our companies are able to conduct independent third-party audits to basically prove, I mean, this is what's required under the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, and also they're going to have to declare in their company management reports under the CSRD in the EU that their operations are free of forced labor. What exactly are we asking for? I mean, how can China create those conditions, and why is it that it's not possible at the moment to conduct such an audit?
Well, given that in Xinjiang, China says there is no problem, living in denial, so to speak, it's very hard for us, in order to have independent, accredited auditing companies, and it by essence have to be international, to go into Xinjiang and make interviews, ask suppliers, walk around in offices and look into contracts if they have been fulfilled or not. It is a transparency issue, and as much as we want it, if there is no problem as indicated by China, then why are we looking into these issues? Again, it's driven by headquarters. It's not necessarily driven by China operations, and headquarters clearly face a lot of scrutiny from parliaments, from NGOs, from media, and it has to be done. So in a way, we're a little bit in a pickle here, that we are constrained, and even though we actually want to do our job. So it's a discussion which we in the European Chamber have been actively promoting. I have been doing this with Minister Wang, who has been attentive about this. They understand the problem, but is there going to be a resolution? I don't see it yet.
Before we move on to discuss ways of mitigating supply chain risks, have either of you got anything to add about the list of reasons companies are shifting supply chain strategies?
Well, I mean, just about a couple of days ago, the US has enforced an incredible act on chips and high-end semiconductors that definitely will change the whole equation. I mean, the fact that some companies in China will be basically unable of producing these semiconductors. They're specialists, particularly if they are US passport holders and green card holders, have to leave. They are on the watch list. Do they get exemption? That remains to be seen. So in a way, if you want to be in high-end manufacturing, if you want to have equipment coming out of China or operate in China that is subject to scrutiny, you really have to do your homework in order to make sure that you don't fall foul. So this US Act has completely changed the game in the top end part of manufacturing.
Yeah, I agree. And strangely underreported as well. They say necessity is the mother of invention. I mean, do you think this could be actually a way to promote innovation in chip making in China? We know that they poured billions and billions of dollars into this over the past couple of decades, but now they put a complete chokehold on the supply of chips. Could that really force them and push them towards getting their own chip industry going?
I mean, in Africa, you have a proverb that says, if you pull the grass, it doesn't grow faster. It's a natural process in order to actually develop new technologies, you need good people for it. It's not the magnitude and the numbers of engineers you have, it's just those Steve Jobs kind of guys that you need. And again, many of them are of Chinese background, but have US citizenship or US green cards. And they are now basically constrained. And again, it's a bit of a shock, I think, in the whole industries, to what extent the Americans are pulling the trigger there. Remains to be seen. If it can be done here, again, throwing money at the problem is not going to resolve the issue. We have a real problem, and the problem is something where actually China really has to do some soul searching of how they can get out of this combative mode with the United States. It's not good for business.
So we need to look at some of the tactics companies are adopting to address supply chain challenges, Joerg. How have businesses shifted their priorities to mitigate risks that we've been discussing?
I think what happens in most companies is that there has been far more extensive training, far more extensive engagement with compliance officers in order to actually make your staff understand where the problem is. It requires a lot of communication skills in order to sensitize your operation about what is at stake. You can't just have a top-down approach there. It really has to have a resonance at the operational level. Some companies, of course, mitigate it by, frankly, putting up new shops elsewhere. We have been saying at the Chamber very often, we are not moving out of China, but many of these restrictions, many of these learnings we had, be it lockdown, be it sanctions, be it Chinese laws, actually force companies to consider plan B or plan C. And that might be that you are putting up new shops elsewhere, closer to home. Also, supply chain is also partly about responsiveness to customer changes in fashion, for example. Yeah. And on top of it, of course, it is in everybody's mind that a ship at the Suez Canal sideways has blocked the most important waterway. So companies are going from just in time and just in case, and you have to basically re-engineer part of your operation in order to actually not only mitigate it, but actually think about it and look for better solutions.
You mentioned earlier, Joerg, that companies are not leaving China. I think this is an important point to make. But there is a sense of decoupling happening, not in the traditional scenario that people expected, which was companies leaving and going home altogether. More that they're disconnecting certain systems between China and their global operations, and that they're sort of bifurcating. So you have one set of systems for China and one for the rest of the world. How would you compare the decoupling that's taken place between the EU and China and the US and China? Do you see any difference there?
Frankly, of course, the US is a far more open economy, but we have a tendency of buy American in the US and buy Chinese in China. So you have German or Central European machinery producers that get told to make sure and certify that their machinery in the US is void of any Chinese components or software. And likewise, you have to do the same over here, that you prove that you have no American chips in there or software. So in a way, it puts a lot of strain on companies in order to comply with the respective laws, but also with the respective taste of customers not wanting to end up in trouble, hence buy America and so forth. So I guess decoupling in essence is impossible. It would be absolutely devastating and very costly and more complex and raising a lot of issues. But as a matter of fact, we have clearly bifurcation happening. The US is clearly in an aggressive mode towards China. Likewise, China is very robust in its appearance. So we just have to see the facts and realize what's going on. And Europe, we are in between to some extent, but at the same time, we also have a political pressure of emulating what the US is doing towards China. We're not there yet, and I hope we don't get there. But at the same time as we don't live in the void, we don't live in the bubble, we have to realize that public opinion in Europe is vastly anti-Chinese right now, and that it might put pressure on headquarters to actually do something about it. It's very hard to understand sometimes. We have to now excuse ourselves of being in China after being applauded investing in China.
Yeah. So, Jens, a lot of the terms that we're seeing in the media these days, reshoring, nearshoring, and friendshoring, were things that we also referred to in our position paper that could be trends that increase in the future. Could you explain what these terms mean and maybe give one or two examples?
Thank you, Carl, and I'll do that in just a moment. First, I'll just want to let up to where Joerg stopped before in regards to that comment that companies are not leaving China. The big problem is obviously that no one is coming right now. Yeah. We have been asking around in the chamber, and to the best of our knowledge, for one and a half years, there are no new European companies coming to China who have not already had a presence here, simply because it's too risky, it's too difficult, the quarantine thing, and no one is going to sink in a big amount of money, make a significant investment if they're not able to come here and actually meet the people, see what it is they're sinking money into, and having that hands-on experience. There are so many other places in the world where you would be able to do that. Maybe there are other places where China will have advantages compared to that, but the fact that you can actually not come here and see your business partners straight in the eye is something that is definitely having an impact. Yeah. In regards to reshoring, nearshoring, and friendshoring, it's something that's been talking a lot about, right? about right now, because we are exactly facing these issues about the resiliency of supply chains. And there are various reasons for that. Joerg just mentioned now sanctions and political initiatives that forces supply chain separation upon companies. And that is certainly one aspect of why it may force companies to move to other places. There's the control aspect. If you cannot have certainty that you will receive certain supplies in due course, then you would need to establish supplier relationships in geographies where you would have an additional layer of security that things will actually come.
This goes back to the point we were saying about the previous status of China as being a reliable sourcing destination is being challenged.
It's being eroded right now, and China has been this fantastic package of where you have had efficiency, you have had transparency, you've had just in time, all these things now. And that sort of great supply chain package is being reduced in its efficiency, whereas at the same time you have other geographies coming up and beginning to be able to deliver some of the things that China had done in the past. China is not going to sort of disappear as the world's largest export nation, but China is definitely facing competition now. And that desire for control, that desire for flexibility also means that some country will be looking at maybe moving production home. Some of them will be looking at moving production to neighboring country. If you're the United States, for example, Mexico, in the European Union, we are also seeing maybe German producers moving production to Poland, if not back to Germany. And it's all part of this, looking at the robustness of supply chains. And that trend, we think, based on what we hear from our members, is only going to continue.
So, essentially what we're looking at, we were talking again in our position paper about China strategies shifting to China plus one or China plus one, plus two, plus three. Is this essentially what it is, where you're still sourcing from China, you still have your supply chains in China, but you also have alternatives? You have robust backup options in the case of certain things happening that prevent you from getting the supplies that you need.
That's exactly right. There is a very, very high commitment amongst our members to stay in China and continue to produce, to sell, and to do all the stuff they do on a daily basis. That commitment has not changed. But people who are dependent deeply on complex supply chains, they want to make sure that they can also continue to operate and thrive as companies independent of what happens in China. And whereas in the past, when we talked about China plus one, you may choose to outsource one specific part of a supply chain to a different country. What we are seeing now is that companies are beginning to ask themselves, if for whatever reason we are encountering a new black swan event, how would our manufacturing, how would our operation look if we were going to operate independently of China? And that's where sort of the China plus 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 gets into the picture. Yeah. Will it be able to actually function as a company if you carve out China, if whatever black swan event would happen? I'd like to emphasize again, our companies are happy being here. Our companies are committed to develop here. But there's also this new sense, you need to prepare for worst case.
So it's resilience that we're talking about. Yes. But this does come at a cost, right? So essentially companies are now willing to have increased costs just to ensure that they have this continuous supply.
I think there is a realization amongst our members that the cost of not being prepared is higher than whatever investment that you might need to make sure that you have resilient, flexible, and transparent supply chains. Yeah. So yes, it comes at a cost, but the cost of doing nothing is multiples higher.
Makes sense. So a question for both of you then. Given that it's consuming in terms of time and resources to be able to find these alternative supplies, is going to happen. Companies are going to have to build that resilience in. Which countries do you see as potentially or already being the beneficiaries of such strategy shifts?
Well, given the slowdown of the Chinese economy, courtesy to, I think, zero COVID policy, the no tolerance policy, likewise also the headwinds we have because of the real estate sector, the debt burden everywhere. It was interesting to see that the World Bank assumes that China grows at half the speed as the rest of Asia. And people look at this and they say, maybe we have peaked in China. We look at other places that we always viewed as more difficult, hence India. Clearly, Southeast Asia might be a winner. But of course, they are on a totally different level from, for example, Guangdong or Jiangsu. The clusters there are very, very hard to replicate elsewhere. And to the point that, of course, supply chain security, the greening of supply chains might lead to more investment, frankly, closer to home. The German magazine Wirtschaftswoche was talking about Eastern Europe being the new China. I mean, that's a bit over the top, but it indicates that the new shift might also really take in this carbon footprint into consideration. And it's just geographic, obviously, the fact that China is far away.
One point to make perhaps is that China really is the 700-pound gorilla in terms of exporting. And no one can go in and replace China in the short term. This will be a gradual shift if it happens. It means also that there are a lot of things that China can do in terms of sort of soothing the concerns that company has in terms of supply chains resilience, supply chain efficiency. And that's, of course, something that we are very eager to engage with the relevant ministries and other institutions. We did study one of our member companies and found that if Chinese exports were to go down by 10% to United States, it will take the rest of ASEAN to grow by 40%. And obviously that cannot happen in just an instant. But I think, there is a yellow card here. Things need to happen. We need to be serious about that. And hopefully we can find a way also in China to make sure that supply chains will be very resilient, efficient, and deliver excellent value for European companies here in China also going forward.
What are your key recommendations for companies that are looking to strengthen their supply chains right now?
Well, I mean, it's scenario thinking. I guess you really have to build in a lot of factors, such as all of a sudden political involvement, the fact, of course, that the greening of the supply chain is a must. Secondly, we have also the human rights situation, again, to consider, the reputational damage companies might face. And at the end of the time, it is also something where we have to see how did China treat foreign companies. The politicization of a couple of suppliers, be it in the textile or shoe industry, has been quite worrisome. And it's very heartening to see that, as a matter of fact, not only are we the largest market, we have about 4 million 40-feet containers entering the European Union in the first 8 months of this year. And there's not been a single consumer boycott of Chinese products, despite all the kind of dislike that you can see in service towards China. So people can distinguish between how they view the political system, at the same time how happy they are going to the shopping center and buying up everything that's made in China.
That's an important point to make. Jens?
At a very practical level, you need to take a very close look at your supply chain if you haven't already done that, making sure that you have visibility through all the links, that you have available alternatives if something go wrong in one of the links of very often complex chains, and that you also understand exactly what needs to get done in case that something goes wrong in the process. I think the lesson from all this is that you never really know what's going to happen tomorrow, what the day looks like when you wake up, and you need to be ready for any contingency in that respect. We cannot simply assume that tomorrow looks like yesterday.
Agreed. So if we assume that things will start to open up again in 2023 in China and travel restrictions will be lifted and the situation of international and domestic travel improves, would China's supply chain situation improve? Do you think companies would slowly start to regain confidence in the market? How do you view that scenario?
I think right now a great many companies are still sitting on the fence, but it's getting increasingly difficult to keep the balance on that fence. And the longer this drags out, the more are going to come to a conclusion that maybe we would need to look elsewhere. But I think there's still, if we see in the relative short term a movement towards making international travel easy and to strengthen supply chains in China, that a lot of those companies that are still sitting on the fence will come down and say, hey, we are going to give it an extra shot here in China. It's getting easier to do business. We can travel again. So let's see what we can do on location here to continue leveraging the great opportunities that do exist in China also going forward.
Not to put you under too much pressure, but you did mention that they may want to look at a certain amount of time, and we know companies are doing scenario planning.
Yeah.
Do you have any idea what would be in companies' minds? How much longer this went on would be enough to change their mind on China completely?
I think it will depend entirely on what company you are, what industry you're sitting in, and your sort of time sensitivities and other sensitivities related to your sourcing. But I think the most important thing right now that can be done is that there is a sort of visibility into what an exit strategy would look like so that companies can begin to plan.
Yeah.
That's what we are all grasping at right now. That is some sort of certainty as to where all this is going. And I think the first thing that needs to happen is exactly that we understand what are the relevant milestones in terms of an opening. And then also, what from a time perspective is it really that we can look forward to? What are the factors, the waypoints that we need to look out for in order for us to sort of begin to gauge when a normalization will happen.
Yeah. Joerg, what's your take if China does suddenly start to open up properly in 2023? How quickly is business confidence going to go back on the rise again?
Well, it all depends on messaging. I mean, we haven't seen any change in language when it comes to zero tolerance. We haven't seen any vaccination drive, which is the essence of preparing the population with herd immunity to open up again. Unless we see any of that, the assumption is we could carry on like this for forever in a way. What happens then, of course, is that companies are establishing beachheads in other countries. They are developing new factories, new supply chains, and these are not reversible. They're not going to go there just in order to bridge China being off the radar for 1 or 2 years. It's going to be permanent. And again, the economic outlook is as such that China is facing headwinds and other countries are reasonably well. That leads to the fact that people might then take advantage. So the longer China waits, the more it opens up the doors in other countries for foreign investment. And on top of it, it's more complex than that because the whole issue about sanctions might actually determine to move elsewhere, even if China opens up. All of a sudden you get your semiconductors maybe not in China anymore. Secondly, you might have a political disadvantage of being viewed as producing in China. It all really depends on how China moves in the next 1 or 2 years to position themselves as a responsible stakeholder, as Bob Zoellick once put it. So in a way, there might be far more criteria for European companies to come back again into China. They go beyond simply traveling to China. Again, there's a distinguishment that Rhodium has pointed out. The top 10 in the car, chemical and mechanical area are coming whatever it takes because this is such a huge market. But for other companies, definitely they have other criteria to follow. So in a way, the good news is that it's all something that China can influence. They can open up themselves. They can be more embracing the globalization story in other countries. It's in their hands. But at the same time, if that doesn't get done, then of course companies draw their conclusions.
Joerg, Jens, it's been a pleasure. Thanks very much for joining China Dispatches. That's all for today. Thank you to our guest speakers Joerg Wuttke and Jens Eskelund. If you like our podcast, please subscribe to China Dispatches, recommend to your colleagues and friends, and share on social media. Also, we'd love to hear your feedback. You can find contact details in the show notes. This is Carl Hayward from China Dispatches. Thanks for listening.